Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women in her small Texas town. While her childhood friends played with dolls and dreamed of wedding dresses, Sarah was climbing trees, building forts, and challenging the neighborhood boys to races she almost always won. Her father, a retired Marine, recognized something special in his daughter early on. He saw the fire in her eyes, the determination that couldn't be taught, and the quiet strength that would one day serve her well in ways he could never imagine. Growing up in Brownsville, Texas, Sarah learned early that the world wasn't always kind to those who dared to be different. Her high school classmates whispered behind her back when she chose shop class over home economics, when she joined the wrestling team instead of the cheerleading squad, and when she announced her intention to join the military instead of attending the local community college like most of her peers. Sarah's mother worried constantly about her daughter's choices. "Mija, why can't you just be normal?" she would plead during their frequent arguments. "Find a nice boy, settle down, have children. This military business is no place for a woman." But Sarah had heard the call to serve something greater than herself, and nothing her family said could shake her resolve. The day Sarah left for boot camp, her father pulled her aside and pressed something into her hand. It was his old Marine Corps ring, worn smooth by years of faithful service. "This doesn't make you a Marine," he said quietly, "but it reminds you that warriors come in all shapes and sizes. Show them what Martinez determination looks like, Mija." Basic training at Naval Station Great Lakes was everything Sarah expected and more. The physical demands were brutal, the mental challenges relentless, and the emotional toll enormous. But, for every drill instructor who tried to break her spirit, Sarah found new reserves of strength she didn't know existed. She excelled in combat training, demolished the obstacle courses, and earned the grudging respect of her fellow recruits. It was during a particularly challenging night exercise that Sarah first caught the attention of Senior Chief Petty Officer Reynolds, a grizzled veteran whose reputation preceded him throughout the base. Reynolds had trained thousands of sailors over his 25-year career, but something about the small Texan caught his eye. While other recruits struggled with the weight of their gear during the 12-mile march, Sarah maintained her pace, helping struggling teammates and never once complaining about the brutal conditions. "Martinez!" Reynolds called out as the exhausted group finally reached their destination. "Front and center." Sarah jogged over, her face streaked with mud and sweat but her eyes bright with determination. "I've been watching you, sailor. You've got something the others don't. Have you ever considered special operations?" The words hit Sarah like a lightning bolt. Special operations meant Navy SEALs, the elite of the elite, warriors who operated in the shadows and accomplished the impossible. It also meant becoming part of a brotherhood that had never included a sister. The Navy had only recently opened SEAL training to women, and the failure rate was astronomical even for the strongest candidates. "I'll do whatever it takes, Senior Chief," Sarah replied without hesitation. Reynolds studied her face, looking for any sign of doubt or false bravado. He found neither. "The training will try to kill you," he said bluntly. 90% of the men who attempt it fail. The instructors will do everything in their power to make you quit. They'll push your body beyond its limits and attack your mind when your body can't take anymore. Are you prepared for that level of suffering? Sarah thought of her father's ring, still tucked safely in her footlocker back at the barracks. She thought of all the people who had told her she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, or tough enough to achieve her dreams. Most of all, she thought of the burning desire that had driven her from the dusty streets of Brownsville to this moment, standing in the Illinois darkness with an opportunity to join the most elite fighting force in the world. "With respect, Senior Chief, I've been preparing for this my whole life." The paperwork for BUD/S basic underwater demolition/SEAL training took months to process. During that time, Sarah threw herself into physical preparation with an intensity that worried her fellow sailors. She ran before dawn, lifted weights during lunch breaks, and swam until the base pool closed at night. Her room became a shrine to preparation, with training manuals, nutritional guides, and workout schedules covering every available surface. The other women on base watched Sarah's transformation with a mixture of admiration and concern. Some offered encouragement, sharing stories of female pioneers in other military specialties and reminding her that she was carrying the hopes and dreams of women throughout the service. Others warned her about the psychological toll of attempting something that had broken so many strong men, urging her to consider less demanding career paths that would still allow her to serve with honor. Sarah listened politely to all advice, but her mind was made up. She knew the statistics better than anyone. She understood that the odds were stacked against her not just as a woman, but as any human being attempting to join the most selective military unit in the world. But statistics had never stopped her before, and they wouldn't stop her now. The call finally came on a cold February morning. Sarah's orders were brief and to the point: report to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, California, for basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, Class 347. She had exactly 2 weeks to get her affairs in order and report for the most challenging experience of her life. Her parents made the drive from Texas to see her off, and, for the first time, Sarah saw pride in her mother's eyes alongside the worry that had been there for months. "I still think you're crazy, Mija," her mother said, embracing her daughter tightly, "but I'm proud of you for chasing your dreams." Her father said nothing, but pressed an updated photo into her hands. It showed him in his dress blues, standing next to Sarah in her Navy uniform from boot camp graduation. On the back, he had written simply, "Para mi guerrera, for my warrior." The flight to San Diego gave Sarah time to think about everything that had led to this moment. She knew that in less than 24 hours, she would begin a journey that would either transform her into one of the world's most elite warriors or break her completely in the attempt. There was no middle ground in SEAL training, no participation trophies or consolation prizes. She would either earn her trident or she would fail, and failure would mean returning to regular Navy service with the knowledge that she hadn't been strong enough to achieve her ultimate goal. But, as the plane descended toward San Diego, Sarah felt nothing but excitement. She had never backed down from a challenge in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. The next 6 months would test every aspect of her physical, mental, and emotional strength, but she was ready. She had trained her body to endure pain, her mind to overcome doubt, and her spirit to never surrender. What Sarah didn't know as she gathered her gear and prepared to step into the most challenging chapter of her life was that her greatest test wouldn't come during the grueling months of BUD/S training. It wouldn't happen during Hell Week, when sleep-deprived candidates are pushed to their absolute breaking point. It wouldn't even occur during the advanced training phases where future SEALs learn to operate in every environment on Earth. No, Sarah's defining moment would come years later, on what seemed like an ordinary evening in a civilian setting, when 3 men would make the fatal mistake of assuming that a woman alone was an easy target. They would learn, too late, that some people are forged in fires hot enough to create the strongest steel, and that challenging a Navy SEAL, regardless of gender, is always a fatal error in judgment. As Sarah Martinez walked across the tarmac at San Diego International Airport, her journey toward that pivotal moment was just beginning. She carried with her the hopes of everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough, the determination of generations of warriors who had served before her, and the unshakable belief that some dreams are worth any sacrifice required to achieve them. The sun was setting over the Pacific Ocean as Sarah caught her first glimpse of the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in the distance. Tomorrow, her transformation from sailor to warrior would begin in earnest. Tonight, she would rest and prepare for the fight of her life, unaware that the skills she was about to learn would one day save not just her own life, but potentially the lives of others who found themselves in harm's way. The stage was set for an extraordinary journey, one that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about herself and forge her into a weapon capable of facing any threat. In the quiet moments before the storm of training began, Sarah Martinez was still just a determined young woman from Texas with big dreams and an unbreakable spirit. By the time her story reached its climax, she would be something much more dangerous and far more capable than anyone who looked at her could possibly imagine. The alarm screamed at 0430 hours, but Sarah had been awake for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and running through mental preparation she had practiced thousands of times. Today marked the beginning of basic underwater demolition/SEAL training, and she knew that within minutes, her comfortable world would cease to exist. The initial shock came not from the physical demands, which she had expected, but from the psychological warfare that began the moment she stepped onto the grinder, the infamous asphalt courtyard where SEAL candidates are broken down and rebuilt. Instructor Petty Officer Harris, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks and a voice that could shatter glass, spotted her immediately. Well, he announced to the entire class, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Looks like we've got ourselves a special case here, gentlemen." The Navy has decided to send us a little girl to play with the big boys.
Tell me, Martinez, did you take a wrong turn on your way to the kitchen?
The other candidates, 43 men ranging in age from 19 to 34, turned to stare at Sarah. Some looked sympathetic, others curious, and a few wore expressions of barely concealed hostility. Sarah had anticipated this moment during her months of preparation, but experiencing it firsthand was different from imagining it. "No excuse, Instructor Harris," she replied, her voice steady and her eyes fixed on a point 6 inches above his head, exactly as she had been trained to respond to any instructor's question.
No excuse? Harris laughed, a sound like grinding metal. We'll see about that, Martinez. We'll see just how long your no-excuse attitude lasts when the real work begins.
The first week of training was designed to weed out those who lacked the fundamental physical fitness required to even attempt the program. Sarah had prepared extensively, but nothing could have readied her for the relentless pace of the instructor's demands. Push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and endless runs on the soft sand that seemed to suck the strength from her legs with every step.
The pool sessions were particularly challenging.
While Sarah was a strong swimmer, the combat swimming techniques required by SEALs pushed her abilities to their limits. The instructors would tie her hands behind her back and order her to swim the length of the pool, retrieve a diving brick from the bottom with her teeth, and perform underwater somersaults while holding her breath until her lungs screamed for air. But it was during drown-proofing that Sarah truly understood what she had gotten herself into. With her hands and feet bound, she was expected to float for 5 minutes, swim 50 meters, and perform a series of underwater tasks that would challenge even an experienced combat swimmer. The first time she attempted the exercise, she nearly panicked as water filled her nose and her body fought against the unnatural restrictions. Only her stubborn refusal to quit in front of the watching instructors kept her going until she completed the task. The mental games were worse than the physical challenges. The instructors used every psychological weapon in their arsenal to break down the candidates' confidence and resolve. They criticized everything from technique to attitude, questioned their motivation, and constantly reminded them that they could quit at any time simply by ringing the brass bell mounted prominently near the grinder. "You know, Martinez," Instructor Johnson said during one particularly brutal session, "there's no shame in admitting you're not cut out for this. Plenty of good sailors serve with honor in the regular Navy. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." The suggestion was delivered with false kindness, but Sarah recognized the trap immediately.
Johnson wasn't offering her an easy way out, he was testing her commitment.
She had seen other candidates fall for similar psychological manipulation, convincing themselves that quitting was the smart choice when the real test was just beginning. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Instructor Johnson," she replied between gasping breaths as she continued her push-ups.
This candidate has no intention of ringing out.
The phrase ringing out referred to the act of quitting, literally ringing the brass bell 3 times and placing one's helmet in the line of those who had surrendered to the training's demands. By the end of the first week, 7 candidates had rung out. By the end of the second week, that number had grown to 15. Sarah watched each departure with mixed emotions, understanding their decision while simultaneously strengthening her own resolve never to join them. Hell Week arrived with the subtlety of a hurricane. For 5.5 days, the remaining candidates would receive a total of perhaps 4 hours of sleep while being pushed through the most demanding physical and mental challenges the instructors could devise. It was during Hell Week that most candidates either found their breaking point or discovered inner strength they never knew existed.
The week began at sunset on Sunday with what the instructors called breakout.
Explosions, sirens, and screaming instructors shattered the relative calm of the previous evening, and suddenly, the candidates found themselves in a world where chaos was the only constant. They were ordered to perform endless calisthenics in the surf, their uniforms soaked with ice-cold Pacific Ocean water that seemed to leach the warmth from their bones.
For Sarah, the first night was a revelation in suffering.
Her body had never experienced this level of sustained abuse, and her mind struggled to process the fact that this was only the beginning. Around her, candidates began to crack.
Some simply stopped moving, their bodies giving out despite their mental determination.
Others became emotional, crying or laughing inappropriately as exhaustion and stress overwhelmed their psychological defenses. By Tuesday morning, the class had shrunk from 28 candidates to 19. The instructors showed no mercy to those who remained, driving them through boat races in the surf, endless runs through the soft sand, and obstacle courses that seemed designed by sadistic engineers. Sarah's hands were raw and, bleeding from rope climbs, her knees were scraped and bruised from belly crawls under barbed wire, and her shoulders screamed in protest every time she was ordered to hold her boat over her head. It was on Wednesday night that Sarah experienced her darkest moment. The candidates had been in the surf for hours, linked arm in arm while waves crashed over their heads. The water temperature was barely above 50 degrees, and hypothermia was becoming a real concern for several members of the class. Sarah found herself shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so violently she could barely understand the instructor's commands. "This is insane," whispered Rodriguez, the candidate next to her. "Nobody should have to endure this. We could die out here." For a moment, Sarah felt herself wavering. The logical part of her mind agreed with Rodriguez. The suffering seemed endless, and she could end it all by simply raising her hand and requesting to be removed from training. She would be warm and dry within minutes, fed within an hour, and sleeping in a comfortable bed before midnight. But then, she thought about her father's ring, still tucked safely in her gear back at the barracks. She thought about every person who had told her she wasn't strong enough, every time she had been underestimated because of her gender, and every woman who might follow in her footsteps if she proved it could be done. The thought of disappointing those future warriors was worse than any physical pain the instructors could inflict. "I'm not going anywhere," she told Rodriguez firmly. "And neither are you if you want to be a SEAL." Rodriguez looked at her with something approaching awe. Here was this small woman, probably 15 pounds lighter than anyone else in the class, refusing to surrender despite suffering the same abuse as everyone else. Her example gave him the strength to continue, and he passed that strength on to the candidate next to him. Thursday brought new challenges and fresh horrors. The candidates were required to carry heavy logs over their heads while running through the sand, their legs cramping and their backs screaming in protest. They performed sugar cookies by rolling in the sand until they were completely covered, then jumping into the surf and repeating the process until their uniforms were stiff with salt and sand. The psychological pressure intensified as well. The instructors whispered constantly about the warm beds waiting just a few yards away, the hot meals being served in the base chow hall, and the simple pleasure of being clean and comfortable. They reminded the candidates that their current misery was entirely voluntary, that they could end their suffering at any moment simply by admitting they weren't strong enough to continue. Friday morning brought what many considered the cruelest challenge of Hell Week, the around-the-world paddle. The remaining candidates, now down to just 14, were loaded into small inflatable boats and ordered to paddle around the entire Coronado Peninsula. The distance was manageable under normal circumstances, but after 4 days of continuous torture, it might as well have been across an ocean. Sarah's boat crew consisted of herself and 5 other candidates who had somehow survived the week's trials. As the only woman, she felt additional pressure to prove herself worthy of their trust and respect. When the team began to lag behind the other boats, she dug deeper into reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, her paddle cutting through the water with mechanical precision despite the fire in her shoulders and the numbness in her hands. "Come on, team," she called out when she noticed their rhythm starting to break down. "We're not finished until we're finished. Keep those paddles moving." Her determination was infectious, and the boat crew found themselves matching her pace even when their bodies begged for rest. They finished the paddle in 3rd place, a respectable showing that earned grudging approval from the instructors. The final night of Hell Week was the longest 12 hours of Sarah's life. The candidates were subjected to a continuous series of challenges designed to test not just their physical endurance, but their ability to think clearly and work as a team despite extreme exhaustion. They were required to solve complex problems while performing calisthenics, navigate obstacle courses in complete darkness, and demonstrate their proficiency with various weapons systems while their hands shook from fatigue. As dawn broke on Saturday morning, Sarah found herself standing on the beach with just 11 other candidates from her original class of 44. They had survived Hell Week, but the victory felt hollow. The training was far from over, and the challenges ahead would be even more demanding than what they had just endured. But something fundamental had changed during those 5 days of sustained suffering. Sarah had discovered that her body could endure far more than she had ever imagined, and, more importantly, she had learned that her mind was capable of overriding even the most desperate physical demands for rest and comfort. She had been tested in the crucible of Hell Week and emerged as something harder and more dangerous than the young woman who had first stepped onto the grinder. The instructors, who had spent the week trying to break her spirit, now looked at her with a different kind of respect. She had proven herself not just as a woman in a man's world, but as a warrior among warriors. The real training was just beginning, but Sarah Martinez was no longer the same person who had arrived at Coronado months earlier. She had been forged in fire and emerged as a weapon capable of accomplishing the impossible. The surviving candidates were given a brief respite to recover from Hell Week, but Sarah knew the celebration would be short-lived. Ahead lay months of advanced training in combat diving, land warfare, and specialized operations. Each phase would bring new challenges and fresh opportunities to fail, but she had crossed a threshold during Hell Week that could never be uncrossed. She was becoming a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the world, and nothing would ever be quite the same. The second phase of BUD/S training introduced Sarah to a world she had only imagined in movies and novels. Combat diving phase pushed her underwater skills to levels that defied logic, teaching her to navigate in complete darkness, fight while submerged, and operate complex equipment while holding her breath for minutes at a time. The pool that had once challenged her during basic training now became her second home, a place where she learned to be as comfortable breathing compressed air through a regulator as she was breathing normal air on the surface. The technical aspects of combat diving required a different kind of mental discipline than the pure physical punishment of Hell Week. Sarah found herself studying dive tables until her eyes burned, memorizing equipment procedures until she could perform them blindfolded, and learning to calculate oxygen toxicity limits and nitrogen narcosis effects while floating 30 feet underwater in complete darkness. The margin for error was zero. A single mistake during a combat dive could kill not just the diver, but an entire team depending on their mission success. Her first night dive was a humbling experience that reminded her how much she still had to learn. The Pacific Ocean at night was an alien environment, where familiar landmarks disappeared and even the most experienced divers could become disoriented in seconds. Sarah's task was straightforward in theory: navigate underwater to a series of checkpoints using only a compass and depth gauge, then return to the starting point within a specified time limit. The reality was far more challenging. The water was murky with stirred sediment, her diving mask began to leak 20 minutes into the exercise, and her compass seemed to be leading her in circles. For nearly an hour, she swam through the black water, her air supply steadily decreasing while she fought rising panic about her inability to locate the checkpoints. When she finally surfaced, exhausted and defeated, she found herself nearly 200 yards from where she was supposed to be. Instructor Williams was waiting for her when she climbed out of the water, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Sarah expected a harsh critique of her performance, but, instead, he simply handed her a towel and said, "How do you think you did out there, Martinez?" "Poorly, Instructor Williams," she replied honestly. "I got disoriented, lost track of my navigation, and failed to complete the exercise successfully." Williams nodded approvingly. "Good assessment. Now tell me what you learned." Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I learned that panic is the enemy of clear thinking underwater. I also learned that my compass skills need serious work, and that I rely too heavily on visual references instead of trusting my instruments." "Excellent. You'll repeat this exercise tomorrow night, and every night after that until you can navigate these waters like a dolphin. Failure is only permanent if you refuse to learn from it." The next 6 weeks transformed Sarah from an adequate swimmer into a lethal underwater operator. She learned to plant explosive charges on ship hulls while remaining completely invisible to surface sentries, to extract intelligence operatives from hostile coastlines during storm conditions, and to engage enemy divers in underwater combat using specialized weapons designed for submerged warfare. The combat aspects of diving phase introduced her to violence in ways that her previous military training had only hinted at. She learned to approach targets silently through the water, neutralize them before they could raise an alarm, and continue with the mission as if nothing had happened. The psychological transition from protector to predator was perhaps the most challenging aspect of her training, requiring her to embrace a mindset that went against her natural instincts. Third phase brought land warfare training, where Sarah finally felt her background giving her some advantage over her male classmates. Her smaller size, which had been a liability during some of the purely strength-based challenges, became an asset when it came to stealth and precision shooting. She could move through dense vegetation without disturbing a single branch, set up sniper positions in spaces too small for larger team members, and remain motionless for hours while observing enemy positions. The marksmanship training was particularly satisfying for Sarah. She had always been a good shot, but SEAL training demanded perfection under conditions that would challenge even experienced marksmen. She learned to engage targets at distances exceeding 1,000 yards, to make precise shots while exhausted from days of continuous operations, and to adapt her techniques to different weapon systems and environmental conditions. Her instructors pushed her harder than ever during land warfare phase, perhaps recognizing that this might be her strongest area and wanting to ensure she reached her absolute potential. She spent countless hours on the shooting range, her shoulder bruised from rifle recoil and her fingers cramped from countless trigger pulls. She practiced urban warfare in mock cities designed to simulate every possible combat environment, from narrow alleyways to multi-story buildings filled with innocent civilians and hidden enemies. The hand-to-hand combat training revealed another dimension of Sarah's capabilities that surprised even her instructors. Her smaller size forced her to rely on technique and speed rather than raw strength, developing a fighting style that was both elegant and devastatingly effective. She learned to use an opponent's size and momentum against them, to strike with surgical precision at vulnerable points, and to end fights quickly before her size disadvantage could become a factor. Instructor Davis, a former special operations soldier with combat experience in 3 different conflicts, pulled her aside after a particularly impressive demonstration during close-quarters combat training. "Martinez, I've seen a lot of fighters come through this program, but there's something different about the way you move. You fight like someone who's been doing this for years, not months." "Thank you, Instructor Davis. I've always believed that technique beats strength if you're smart about how you apply it." "It's more than that," Davis replied. "You have what we call killer instinct. When you engage a target, there's no hesitation, no second guessing. You commit completely to the action. That's a rare quality, and it's going to serve you well in the field." The psychological profiling that accompanied advanced training revealed aspects of Sarah's personality that she hadn't fully recognized herself. The military psychologists noted her unusual combination of empathy and ruthlessness, her ability to form strong emotional connections with teammates while maintaining the emotional distance necessary to complete missions that might put those same teammates at risk. "You're an interesting case, Petty Officer Martinez," Dr. Sarah Chen explained during one of their regular sessions. "Most operators lean heavily toward one end of the emotional spectrum or the other. They're either highly empathetic team players who struggle with the more violent aspects of the job, or they're natural predators who have difficulty forming meaningful relationships with their teammates. You seem to have found a balance between the 2 extremes. Is that a problem, Doctor?" "On the contrary, it's exactly what we look for in elite operators. The ability to care deeply about your teammates while still being willing to do whatever is necessary to complete the mission is the mark of a truly exceptional warrior. The question is whether you can maintain that balance under the stress of actual combat operations." The final phases of training focused on mission planning and team leadership. Sarah learned to analyze intelligence reports, develop operational plans for complex missions, and coordinate multi-team operations involving air, sea, and land components. She discovered an aptitude for strategic thinking that complemented her tactical skills, and her instructors began assigning her leadership roles during training exercises. Her first command of a training mission was both exhilarating and terrifying. She was responsible for leading a 4-man team in a simulated hostage rescue operation, complete with live ammunition, explosive charges, and role players acting as both hostages and terrorists. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. A single mistake could result in the death of innocent civilians or members of her own team. The mission required her team to infiltrate a mock compound under cover of darkness, neutralize the enemy guards without raising an alarm, locate and extract 3 hostages, and exfiltrate to a safe area within a specific time limit. The exercise was designed to test not just tactical skills, but decision-making ability under pressure and the capacity to adapt when the original plan went wrong. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. One of her team members stepped on a pressure plate that triggered an alarm, alerting the entire compound to their presence. A hostage turned out to be a disguised enemy operative who attacked her team from behind. The extraction helicopter was shot down during the approach, forcing them to reach an alternative pickup point several miles away. But Sarah's training held firm under pressure. She adapted to each setback calmly and efficiently, making split-second decisions that kept her team alive and moving toward their objective. When they finally reached the extraction point with all 3 hostages and no casualties, the watching instructors couldn't hide their approval. "Outstanding leadership under pressure," Martinez, Senior Chief Reynolds told her during the debrief. "You demonstrated exactly the kind of adaptability and decision-making ability we need in our operators. Your team trusted you completely, and you earned that trust by getting them home safely." Graduation from BUD/S was an emotional milestone that Sarah had dreamed about for over a year. Standing with the 11 other candidates who had survived the complete training program, she felt a sense of accomplishment that eclipsed every other achievement in her life. The trident pin that was ceremoniously placed on her uniform represented more than just successful completion of training. It marked her transformation from an ordinary sailor into one of the most elite warriors in the world. But even as she celebrated with her classmates and their families, Sarah understood that graduation was not the end of her journey, but the beginning. She would now be assigned to an operational SEAL team, where she would put her training to use in real-world missions with consequences that went far beyond training exercises. The skills she had learned would be tested in environments where failure meant not just personal disappointment, but potential loss of life for herself and her teammates. The young woman who had left Texas with big dreams and unlimited determination had been forged into a precision weapon capable of operating in any environment against any enemy. She could kill silently with her bare hands, hit targets at impossible distances with a variety of weapons, and lead teams of elite operators through missions that ordinary soldiers couldn't even imagine attempting. What Sarah didn't know as she stood proudly wearing her new trident pin was that all of this training, every painful lesson and hard-won skill, was preparing her for a moment that had nothing to do with military operations or foreign enemies. Her defining test would come not on a battlefield overseas, but in a civilian setting where 3 men would make the fatal mistake of assuming that a woman alone was vulnerable and defenseless. The warrior that emerged from BUD/S training was a far cry from the determined young woman who had first reported to Coronado. She had been tested in every conceivable way and had proven herself worthy of standing alongside the most elite operators in the world. Now it was time to put that training to use, unaware that her most important mission was still years away, waiting for her in the seemingly safe confines of civilian life. 3 years had passed since Sarah Martinez earned her trident pin, 3 years of operational deployments that had taken her to every corner of the globe. She had conducted nighttime raids in Afghanistan, provided security for high-value targets in Iraq, and executed precision strikes against terrorist networks in locations that didn't officially exist on any military maps. Each mission had added layers to her skill set and reinforced the deadly efficiency that her training had instilled. Now, at 28 years old, Sarah was on administrative leave, taking a much-needed break between deployments at her small apartment in Virginia Beach. The transition from the high-stress environment of special operations to civilian life was always challenging for military personnel, but Sarah had learned to appreciate these quiet periods as opportunities to decompress and maintain some connection to the normal world she protected but rarely experienced. On this particular Tuesday evening in September, Sarah decided to meet her college roommate, Jennifer, for dinner at a small restaurant in downtown Norfolk. The establishment was nothing fancy, just a local place known for good food and a relaxed atmosphere where conversations could flow without interruption. Sarah had deliberately chosen civilian clothes that concealed her athletic build, preferring to blend in rather than draw attention to herself during her off-duty time. The dinner was exactly what Sarah needed. Jennifer, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, provided a window into civilian life that helped Sarah maintain perspective on why her sacrifices and service mattered. They talked about Jennifer's recent promotion, her plans for returning to school, and the ordinary challenges and victories that filled most people's lives. As the evening wound down, Sarah insisted on walking Jennifer to her car despite her friend's protests that the parking garage was perfectly safe. Years of tactical training had made Sarah hyper-aware of potential threats in any environment, and the dimly lit parking structure triggered instincts that she couldn't simply turn off. "You worry too much," Jennifer laughed as they reached her small Honda Civic. "This isn't Afghanistan, Sarah.
It's Norfolk, Virginia. The biggest threat here is getting a parking ticket.
Sarah smiled and hugged her friend goodbye, but her eyes continued scanning the garage even as they chatted. She noticed a group of 3 men loitering near the stairwell, their behavior setting off subtle alarm bells in her subconscious. They appeared to be watching Jennifer's car, and their positioning suggested coordination rather than coincidence. After Jennifer drove away, Sarah began walking toward her own vehicle, a nondescript sedan parked 2 levels up. Her route took her past the 3 men she had noticed earlier, and, as she approached, her training kicked into high gear. Their body language had shifted from casual loitering to predatory focus, and she realized with crystal clarity that she had become their target of opportunity. The first man, a stocky individual with prison tattoos covering his arms, stepped directly into her path while his 2 companions moved to flank her. In the civilian world, this might have appeared to be a random mugging attempt, but Sarah's trained eye immediately assessed their coordination, positioning, and intent. These were not desperate amateurs, they were experienced predators who had clearly done this before. "Evening, sweetheart," the leader said, his voice carrying a mixture of false friendliness and barely concealed menace.
"Pretty little thing like you shouldn't be walking around here all alone. Dangerous neighborhood, you know?" Sarah's response was immediate and calculated.
Rather than show fear or attempt to flee, she stopped walking and faced the 3 men directly, her posture relaxed but balanced, her hands loose at her sides. Years of combat experience had taught her that predators expected fear and submission from their victims, and any deviation from that expected response could provide crucial tactical advantages. "I appreciate your concern," she replied calmly, her voice steady and confident. "But I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself." The second man, taller and leaner than his leader, laughed mockingly. "Oh, we've got ourselves a tough girl here, boys. Think she's some kind of badass because she watched a few self-defense videos on YouTube." What the 3 men couldn't have known was that they were facing someone who had been trained to assess and neutralize threats with surgical precision. Sarah's mind was already running tactical calculations, identifying weapons, escape routes, and the most efficient methods of disabling multiple attackers. She noted that the leader favored his right side, suggesting a previous injury to his left leg. The tall man's stance indicated limited hand-to-hand combat experience, while the third attacker, who had remained silent, moved with the controlled aggression of someone with actual fighting experience. "Look, lady," the leader continued, pulling a switchblade from his pocket and opening it with practiced ease, "we're not looking to hurt anybody. Just hand over your purse, your jewelry, and maybe we'll forget we ever saw you." The appearance of the weapon triggered a fundamental shift in Sarah's mental state. Her SEAL training had conditioned her to respond to lethal threats with overwhelming force, and the knife transformed this encounter from a potential robbery to a life-or-death situation. The 3 men had just crossed a line they couldn't uncross, escalating the situation beyond the point where peaceful resolution was possible. "That was a mistake," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a new tone that should have warned the attackers they had seriously misjudged their intended victim. But the men were too committed to their course of action to recognize the danger they had placed themselves in. The leader stepped closer, waving his knife in what he probably thought was an intimidating manner. "What's that supposed to mean, princess? You gonna call the cops? Scream for help? Nobody's coming to save you down here." What happened next unfolded with the terrifying efficiency that only comes from years of lethal training and combat experience. Sarah moved with liquid grace, her body flowing through a sequence of actions that had been drilled into her muscle memory through thousands of hours of practice. Her right hand struck the leader's wrist with surgical precision, causing him to drop the knife as his nervous system short-circuited from the targeted blow to a pressure point. Before the weapon hit the ground, Sarah's left elbow was already driving into the man's solar plexus, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for air. She pivoted smoothly on her left foot, her right leg sweeping the legs of the second attacker and sending him crashing to the concrete floor with a sickening thud. The third man, who had shown signs of actual fighting ability, reacted faster than his companions, throwing a wild punch aimed at Sarah's head. But Sarah had been training for this exact scenario since her first day at Coronado, and civilian fighting skills, no matter how developed, were no match for military close-quarters combat techniques. She deflected his punch with minimal effort, using his forward momentum to pull him off balance while simultaneously driving her knee into his midsection. As he doubled over from the impact, Sarah's hands moved to either side of his head, applying pressure to specific nerve clusters that caused him to lose consciousness almost instantly. The entire encounter lasted less than 20 seconds from the moment the leader pulled his knife until all three attackers were neutralized and lying motionless on the garage floor. Sarah stood over them, breathing slowly and steadily, her heart rate barely elevated despite having just engaged in mortal combat against multiple opponents. She quickly assessed the situation from a tactical perspective. The men were alive but incapacitated, likely to remain unconscious for several minutes. She had sustained no injuries, and there were no witnesses to the encounter. Her training suggested that the most prudent course of action would be to leave immediately and avoid potential complications with law enforcement, but her moral compass demanded a different response. Using her cell phone, Sarah called 911 and reported the attempted robbery, providing a factual but carefully edited account of the evening's events. She explained that she had been attacked by three men in the parking garage, that she had defended herself successfully, and that the attackers required medical attention. She deliberately omitted the specific techniques she had used, describing her response simply as self-defense. When the police and paramedics arrived 15 minutes later, they found a scene that defied easy explanation. Three grown men, all with extensive criminal records as they later discovered, were unconscious and suffering from what appeared to be precisely applied trauma to various pressure points and nerve clusters. The victim, a small woman who couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds, was sitting calmly on a nearby bench, showing no signs of distress or injury. Detective Rodriguez, the first investigator on the scene, had been working violent crimes for over 15 years, but he had never encountered anything quite like this. The attacker's injuries were too precise, too surgically applied, to have resulted from lucky punches or random self-defense moves. Someone with extensive martial arts or military training had neutralized three dangerous criminals with minimal force and maximum efficiency. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here tonight," Rodriguez said, approaching Sarah with the careful respect of someone who recognized that appearances could be deceiving. "Of course, Detective. I'm happy to cooperate with your investigation. Can you walk me through the events leading up to this incident?" Sarah provided a straightforward account of the evening, from dinner with her friend through the confrontation in the parking garage. She answered every question honestly but offered no additional information about her background or training unless specifically asked. Her military experience had taught her that volunteering information could sometimes complicate situations unnecessarily. "Ms. Martinez, I have to say, it's unusual for someone to defend themselves this effectively against three armed attackers. Do you have any martial arts training or self-defense experience?" "I served in the military, Detective. We received basic hand-to-hand combat training as part of our service." It was technically true, though basic hardly described the advanced combat techniques that had allowed her to neutralize the threat so efficiently. Rodriguez nodded, apparently satisfied with her explanation, though Sarah could see in his eyes that he suspected there was more to the story. The three attackers were transported to the hospital with various injuries ranging from concussion to nerve damage. All three survived, though they would require weeks of recovery time. During their medical treatment, investigators discovered that they were part of a larger criminal organization that had been targeting women in parking garages throughout the Norfolk area for several months. James Morrison, the leader of the group, had a criminal record spanning 20 years and including multiple counts of assault, robbery, and sexual assault. His two companions, David Chen and Marcus Williams, were similarly experienced criminals with extensive histories of violent crime. The Norfolk Police Department estimated that the three men had been responsible for at least 12 similar attacks in the previous 6 months. The irony was not lost on Sarah that these three predators, who had built their criminal careers on targeting women they perceived as vulnerable and defenseless, had chosen as their final victim someone specifically trained to neutralize exactly their type of threat. Their fundamental miscalculation about her capabilities had not only ended their criminal spree but had potentially saved an unknown number of future victims from their predatory behavior. When the media picked up the story several days later, it became a sensation throughout the Hampton Roads area. The headlines varied, but they all focused on the same remarkable fact: a single woman had successfully defended herself against three armed attackers, leaving them all requiring hospitalization while sustaining no injuries herself. Sarah declined all interview requests, preferring to maintain her privacy and avoid the spotlight that would inevitably follow such a story. She understood that public attention could compromise her ability to perform her military duties effectively, and she had no desire to become a celebrity because of what she considered to be simply doing what was necessary to protect herself. But the story resonated with people throughout the community, particularly with women who had felt vulnerable in similar situations. Sarah began receiving letters from strangers thanking her for proving that women didn't have to be victims, that training and preparation could level the playing field against those who would prey on the innocent. One letter came from a college student who had begun taking self-defense classes after reading about the incident. Another came from a nurse who had started varying her route home from work and paying more attention to her surroundings. Each letter reminded Sarah that her actions that night had consequences far beyond the immediate situation, inspiring others to take control of their own safety and refuse to live in fear. The three attackers eventually pled guilty to multiple charges related to their criminal activities, receiving lengthy prison sentences that effectively ended their careers as predators. During their court appearances, they showed no signs of the arrogance and confidence they had displayed that night in the parking garage. They had learned, too late, that challenging someone trained to be a weapon was the last mistake they would make as free men. For Sarah, the incident served as a reminder of why her service mattered. The skills she had learned through years of grueling training had protected not just herself, but potentially dozens of future victims who would never know how close they had come to experiencing the terror these men had inflicted on others. Her moment of greatest civilian danger had become an opportunity to prove that the warrior she had become could protect the innocent even outside the context of military operations. The quiet evening that had started with dinner and conversation had ended with three predators learning the hard way that appearances can be fatally deceiving. Their assumption that a woman alone was automatically vulnerable had cost them their freedom and their careers as criminals. Sarah Martinez, the Navy SEAL they had mistaken for an easy target, had demonstrated with devastating efficiency that challenging the wrong person could indeed be a fatal error in judgment.